Thank you very much for the invitation. I was asked to talk about participation in European Parliament elections in times of crisis. Our first disclosure is there are greater experts on this topic than me in the room. But the main reason for this is that with a number of colleagues, I've designed a field experiment that is aimed at trying to measure and establish whether institutional information campaigns might have an effect on turnout rates and might boost turnout. So, because I felt a little bit awkward telling you about a project that we don't know as yet whether it will be funded or not, I've sort of packaged it with some kind of preamble about turnout in elections, mostly to justify why this experiment is interesting and worth funding, ideally by the European Parliament, the DG Communications, to whom we've actually sent the application. So I'll start with a descriptive summary of trends in turnout in EP elections. I will move on to give you some sort of considerations and some sort of quick data analysis on how past behavior might tell us something about turnout in EP elections in times of crisis, with a view of doing some speculative projections maybe on 2014. And then I'll present the design of our field experiment briefly. I won't have much time to do it anyway. So that's just a sort of kind of very noisy first graph to show you that actually when we look at turnout trends in European Parliament elections, there's a lot of things sort of going on. There are no necessarily clear trends that we can establish in a sort of kind of unique direction. And because actually one of the main difficulties that we face when looking at turnout trends is that we have countries that have started participating in European Parliament elections at different points in time. There are a number of countries for which we can't really say much, and those are the countries that you joined in the last two elections. So if we move into looking only at those that have had more than two elections and don't enforce compulsory voting, what we find is that turnout in EP elections that are higher than 60% are quite unusual and quite limited to countries who have had compulsory voting at some point or to first elections. And that actually looking at these countries that have more than two European Parliament elections, turnout rates tend to vary mostly between 40 and 60%. What is also interesting, at least in my view, is that there is a gradual convergence, not just towards lower turnout, but also towards more similarity in terms of the rates of turnout across countries. If we sort of split this sort of large group of, well, the EU 15 group of trends into two, we can actually see that there are different things going on in different countries. There is, of course, a majority of EU 15 countries with a steadily declining turnout rates, or there's another group with stable low rates after an initial decrease that is posterior to the first one or two European Parliament elections, like Spain, Portugal, Austria, and Finland. In a number of countries, however, turnout rates have been relatively stable since 1979 or have shown trendless fluctuations in Denmark, in Ireland, in the UK, and in Sweden. So all in all, I fully agree with Mark Frankling that there's not a huge decline necessarily, and that it's actually relatively uneven across countries. So is this turnout decline in European Parliament elections just reflecting overall turnout decline? And for that, it might be useful to look at turnout ratios between European Parliament and national, and by this I mean legislative national elections. Again, we find two sort of different sets of patterns. In most countries that have a decline in absolute turnout rates, we also see an increasing gap between turnout in European Parliament elections and national legislative elections. So the lower turnout in European Parliament elections is getting larger as compared to whatever their turnout rates are in national elections, with the exception possibly of France and some fluctuations in the Netherlands. However, in countries with no absolute declines in terms of the absolute turnout rate, we see either some trendless fluctuation, like in Ireland, or a slow gradual trend towards a narrowing gap. So in terms of now that we see that there are actually sort of different patterns of not just levels of turnout, but also trends in turnout and how they differ in relation to national elections, we might have a look, and more specifically on the topic of this dissemination conference, on the role of economic crisis. Does that affect at all turnout behavior? Now, when you look at studies of European Parliament voting, they are much more detailed usually on explaining vote choices than on participation choices. I'm not suggesting that there's no research on explaining turnout, but the literature is much more abundant on vote choices, and there's a reason for that. We're ultimately much more interested on the outcomes of elections rather than necessarily on turnout per se. However, the existing studies do give us some clues on reasons for lower turnout and potentially also for declining turnout, although sometimes these claims are not necessarily always explicitly made about trends. First, there's a general declining trend due to social and political changes, and the work by Mark Franklin and Russell Dalton would point in this direction. There's also a suggestion that second-order elections are more prone to low turnout, and this has been shown. And of course, in the context of an increasing lack of mobilization by political parties during campaigns, and this difference between second-order election mobilization and first-order election mobilization, this could actually lead to sort of incremental declining turnout. And that's actually probably the case, especially in a context in which until now we've not detected much protest voting as a primary motivating force for European Parliament voting. A third reason might be that the lack of representation of citizens' preferences on EU matters by the large governing parties, as we know, leads to abstention. And if mainstream parties are increasingly adopting pro-European Union positions and not critical positions, and in a number of countries we don't have credible anti-EU challengers, then increasing abstention might be expected over time. So in the current climate, which is one, as we all know, and we've been listening for the last 2 days, of high disaffection with EU-level economic policies, citizens that are increasingly alienated with the political class. I mean, in some countries they had been alienated for a long time, but this has reached levels that in some countries are unprecedented. And additionally, in a situation in which in many countries to this whole dissatisfaction in relation to the economy, we add a considerable dissatisfaction linked to numerous political scandals. What are our expectations in terms of turnout effects for the 2014 elections? We might have two opposing expectations. One is that this insatisfaction and anger might lead to greater abstention, primarily due to disaffection, and this being the sort of natural outcome for disaffected citizens. We could also expect greater turnout due to the awareness, the increased awareness of the relevance of policies at the EU level, and Sarah's presentation leads to thinking that there's some of that. The work by some scholars and Sarah's work in particular actually finds that negative campaigns don't necessarily have a clear effect. So the tone, whether the campaign is negative or positive, doesn't necessarily have a clear effect. So I've had a quick sort of look at the data. I'm not claiming this to be a fully finished paper on that. And using actually Matilda's data set and extending it and then sort of using Mark Franklin's indication of the main relevant control variables, I've looked into the effect of three variables. The existence of economic recession as measured by defined as 3 consecutive quarters with negative real GDP growth, economic crisis, which is a slightly less demanding and therefore more common occurrence than recession, and it's here defined only as the previous or the election year with negative real GDP growth, and unemployment crisis, which I define as the previous or the election year with considerably higher than usual unemployment. And I look also at the joint effect of recession and unemployment, and controlling for the variables that have been identified in past research as relevant, and those include turnout rates in previous national legislative elections, months to the next general election, concurrent elections, etc. One first caveat in this sort of analysis of trying to figure out whether actually a situation of economic crisis does matter or not is that, of course, the number of data points is relatively limited, and also the number of time points that we have is varying across the countries just by the nature of when they entered the European Parliament. And an important limitation as well is that crisis and recession were a constant for all of the countries in 2009. So that's something that we need to bear in mind when interpreting the data, and I will be extra cautious about the results, because I think that ultimately the quality of the data that you have to shape the sort of conclusions that we can draw from it. So using two-level, multi-level regression, I can show you some, what I find is some interesting and to a certain extent puzzling findings. I hope you might see something, highlighted colors to help you detect at least the positive and the negative coefficients. So when we model the existing data, and as I said, the results are subject to quite some degree of uncertainty, an interesting finding is that it seems that economic recessions or crisis on their own don't seem to have negative effects on turnout, or actually the coefficients sort of change depending on, I mean, that they have a negative value both for recession and crisis, but they're very far away from being significant. It's interesting, however, then when we look specifically at unemployment, it looks like maybe an employment crisis, which in some countries are actually separate from the existence of of a recession and just a slowdown in economic production, that they can actually have the opposite effect. And I find it very interesting that it looks that this sort of mobilizing effect seems to be sort of higher and especially relevant when combined with the existence of a recession and an economic crisis. So given these, I think we might see higher turnout in European Parliament elections when the recession is accompanied by a considerable spike in unemployment. And this might be actually the case of most Southern European countries, but on the basis of what the past behavior tells us, which does not necessarily have to hold also in these elections, but it's all that we have, we might not expect any change or further decline in the rest of the country. So actually finding different results in terms of turnout or change in turnout rather across the European countries. So in this context, is there anything that can be done, not just in terms of trying to boost turnout rates in the 2014 European Parliament election, but also in the longer round, if decline in European Parliament election turnout seems a trend in some countries at least, even if not in all of them. And here's where I'm going to briefly present the design of the project that we've put forward to the European Parliament. In 6 countries, in Belgium, in Denmark, in Germany. Thomas Pukunke is one of the colleagues working in this project. In Romania, in Spain, and in the UK, we've designed a set of field experiments for these European Parliament elections, trying to assess whether institutional information campaigns, and primarily because the main contention in this scholarly research is that information about the role of the European Parliament and its relevance and what it does and how it affects citizens' life is what will probably make the difference in terms of citizens judging the elections as consequential and hence being more likely to turn out. So we've designed a project that will provide citizens with information about European Parliament election, its functions and powers, make them aware of the elections, of when they're happening, and how actually their votes translate into seats in the different countries. And the plan is to subsequently evaluate whether providing this information has an effect whatsoever. On the one hand, on voter registration levels on mobile EU citizens, or as it's sometimes called second country nationals, and on the other hand on the turnout levels of the general electorate. And for these we are planning on conducting a multi-methods campaign that will combine some events that are targeted at second country nationals prior to the deadlines for electoral registration in the respective countries, information events and targeted at the general electorate in April, May, and the distribution of leaflets to citizens' households. So you can quickly see there how we've designed it, and we have sort of overlapping design in some countries. So in Belgium, in Spain, and the UK, we would be doing this distribution of leaflets and organization of events targeting second country nationals, whereas in Denmark, Germany, Romania, Spain, and the UK, we would only well, not only in Spain and the UK, we would be doing the distribution of leaflets and the events directed at the general electorate. Our plan is to include information on voting advice applications in these leaflets, and precisely because the discussion in the session yesterday and in previous scholarship, we did this design a few months ago, suggests that these applications can probably increase turnout through the provision of information. And of course, the main goal is after the elections to analyze the data and compare the experimental and the control areas, and to find out whether in the real world institutional campaigns can actually boost turnout just by providing information alone. So we hope we get the funding. If we do, we'll let you know. If anyone's interested in the specific details of the research design, I would be happy to send you our research proposal, and any suggestions that you may have will be more than welcome. Thank you.